Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in the USA. Without a shadow of a doubt, the biggest news economically over the past 12 months was the introduction of Donald Trump's tariffs. Back in April of 25, he came out onto the steps of the White House and said that he was imposing tariffs on every single country in the world and that all of the imports were going to cost more. And this was done under emergency powers. He said that this was in the interests of national security. But unfortunately for the USA and Donald Trump, the Supreme Court has now overruled that. They have deemed that the US president overstretched his powers and that trade should actually remain under the power of Congress. So they've said that this wasn't in the interests of national security and that this was just being done for trade purposes. And it was ruled 6-3 in favour of overruling these tariffs. So they have now been cancelled. And this throws up a whole lot of questions in terms of what is going to happen to all of the money that has been taken for all of the tariffs so far. It's estimated that we are currently running at $175 billion. And let's not forget, in terms of who's paid those tariffs, I think the misconception is that the overseas companies that are sending things to the USA are paying for these tariffs. That isn't the situation. It is companies and individuals within the USA who have bought those items. They are the ones that are paying the tariffs to get them released from all of the security areas. So there's a lot of companies in the USA right now who are putting legal action together to reclaim that 175 billion that's been taken by the US government. Now, as you might imagine, Donald Trump is not very happy about this situation. Let's hear what he had to say about it.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you.
So following on from that statement, he then posted this onto Truth Social. It says, "It is my great honour to have just signed from the Oval Office a global 10% tariff on all countries, which will be effective almost immediately. Thank you for your attention on this matter." Now, you might be sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, how is he able to introduce a global 10% tariff when the Supreme Court has just overruled all of the tariffs? That doesn't seem to make sense. The Supreme Court basically said that this isn't within the power of the president. This is something that Congress has to pass. Well, the reason why he said that is because there is now another loophole. So Donald Trump is implementing the new baseline duty under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which grants the president unilateral ability to impose tariffs. But the untested legal provision here is that it's only a 150-day limit on how long those duties can remain in place. So technically, it looks like Congress will need to approve these tariffs, and that's probably not going to happen. But what we've got here is another loophole that Donald Trump is trying to exploit to introduce more tariffs. So, and these new 10% tariffs go into effect on the 24th of February, so almost straight away. So this is causing real disruption in terms of what's going on in the USA, because if you're a company that's importing things, you don't really know what's going on. Previously, if you were importing from countries like China and Vietnam, you were paying 30, 40, 50% tariff. So basically 30, 40, 50% more for all of those imports. Now you might be able to get all of that money back. Plus there now might be another 10% tariff going on top. So this is becoming quite a messy situation. So what does all of this mean for the US economy and, in fact, the global economy? Well, what we've got is another period of uncertainty where nobody really knows what's going on with pricing, because that's basically the bottom line here. We're talking about the price of imports into the USA. The tariffs increase the price of all of those imports, which has had an inflationary impact on a lot of things that have been imported into the USA. So that's been impacting on the Fed's ability to reduce interest rates. You'll be aware that Donald Trump has been putting pressure onto the Fed, particularly onto Jerome Powell, to reduce rates at a much faster rate than he has been doing. But the reason why Jerome Powell wasn't is because inflation has remained sticky. And one of the reasons why is because of these tariffs. If these tariffs are now removed, then that's obviously going to release the pressure on prices. But the big question is, who's going to pay back the $175 billion that's been taken so far? If the government has to hand that back to all of the companies in the USA, let's not forget, it's not handing it back to the overseas companies that were sending things to the USA. This is companies in the US who've paid those tariffs. They are the ones that want the money back. There's already around about 1,800 court cases that are pending, legal action that's been filed against the government saying that we're not happy about these tariffs, we want our money back. I think there's now going to be a wave of litigation in the USA. This is really good news if you're a lawyer in the US, because it's likely that there's going to be years worth of litigation here where companies are trying to reclaim all of this money back. The Supreme Court, basically their judgment is saying that money should never have been taken. So therefore, people will want a refund. Lots of companies have been negatively impacted by this. But on the flip side, we've also got the impact on the global economy because the tariffs have caused a global reorganization. Lots of companies have pivoted. So China has seen a massive reduction in the amount that it's exporting to the USA as a result of these price increases caused by the tariffs. And China is now flooding places like Europe and Africa with more goods, trying to find a home for that. The Chinese economy is in real trouble at the moment. Lots of Chinese businesses are banking losses because they've had to keep cutting their prices to try to find buyers for their products. So we may see China doing something in retaliation. Maybe they will start moving that product back to the USA now that it's going to be more cost effective to do so. We might also see other countries following suit. There's also a chance with this new 10% tariff that's just been announced that there could be retaliatory tariffs. So other countries might decide to start tariffing US goods, and we've seen that before. When that happened previously with China, then we got into an escalation between Donald Trump and China, and at one point the tariffs were over 100% on all of the imports into the US. So there's lots of potential implications for this, but I think the bottom line here is that the US government is now going to have to reassess what's going on with the tariffs. It's going to have to decide what happens with those refund claims. And also, there's a huge administrative burden here. Whoever's working out all of these tariffs and how much has to be paid to release things from the docks and the airports, all of those goods that have been imported to the US that companies need to carry on their trade. And it's not just items that are being sold in the US. There's lots of companies that have components and supplies and things that are important in their processes, in their manufacturing that they import. So they can't afford to have things held up because that would affect US businesses. The bottom line is that it's US companies that suffer the most from these tariffs, not the overseas companies. They are seeing a reduction in terms of the volume of exports. But as I just said, companies in China are pivoting and sending those products to other countries instead. So this has caused real disruption in the USA in terms of what's going on with trade and supply chains. And I think this announcement that the tariffs have been overruled, firstly, is a bit embarrassing for Donald Trump because he imposed all of this. It was big news. It's been really big news for the past 12 months. It's now been overturned by the USA courts. So that's slightly embarrassing if you're the president, if you've done that. But more importantly, it really throws up into the air the whole concept of resetting the global trade arrangements between the USA and every country because the balance of trade is in the other country's favor. The USA does buy more from other countries than it's selling. But the reason for that is because the USA is the biggest economy in the world. It's got the most purchasing power and it buys things from countries that have got low labor costs. So it's more cost effective for the USA to import things from countries like China and Vietnam and Mexico than it is to actually make a lot of products in the US. And we've talked about this before. Whilst in theory it would be great for the USA to produce everything itself and then purchase all of those products, the cost of things would be astronomical. So I talked about an iPhone in the past. It would increase in price from something like $1,000 to $5,000 if everything was made in the US, because it's so much more expensive to do everything than it is outsourcing it to low labor cost economies. So I think it's unrealistic for Donald Trump to say that he wants equilibrium in terms of the trading relationships. That's not how the world works. If you're the biggest buyer, then obviously you're going to be buying more things than you're selling. The USA doesn't sell lots of things around the world like China does. It sells high value products and things that can't be made elsewhere, and vehicles and things like that. But it just can't compete with countries like China and Vietnam in terms of labor costs. So therefore, from a price point of view, it's not going to be able to compete on price. So you buy an Apple iPhone because it's made by Apple and it's the best in the world. But there are alternatives from other countries. But the reason why you buy Apple is because you want that brand. If the USA was producing low cost mobile phones, they wouldn't be making a lot of money because they can't produce it as lower cost as other countries can. So the overall summary of today's video is that the Supreme Court overruling Donald Trump's tariffs really throws into question what's going on with pricing in the USA. If you're importing goods at the moment, it's very difficult to know exactly what the price is going to be because you don't really know what tariff is going to be applied. There's going to be a huge wave of litigation in the USA from companies who've been paying these tariffs for the past 10 months or so. They will want all of their money back. That puts a bit of pressure onto the US government to release that $175 billion that's been taken for all of these tariffs. And all of this is now throwing up the question as to whether or not Donald Trump's new 10% tariff that he's just announced will actually hold up. Will that also be overturned by the Supreme Court? Will it be knocked down by Congress when it comes up for approval? Nobody really knows the answer to any of this. And what we've got is a really messy situation in terms of the imports into the USA and global trade at the moment. So it will be fascinating to see what happens going forward over the next few months, whether or not the new 10% tariff remains in place, whether we see any retaliation from other countries, but we have got a real mess at the moment. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. You can scan the QR code on the screen now to see the details of that. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. Really appreciate that support. And here's something to put a smile on your face.